Listos. Periodistas. Elvira, me avisa cuando estén listos. Listos. Bien, damos la bienvenida al señor Kremer, al ministro Isa, a todos los periodistas y a los invitados de nuestros visitantes. Les voy a hacer una propuesta antes de avanzar, que la primera parte le demos la oportunidad al señor Kremer de exponer cuáles son sus consideraciones, lo que le mereció el Premio Nobel de Economía 2019 y que en una segunda parte, como suele ocurrir aquí, después del almuerzo, que le demos la oportunidad al ministro Isa de exponer sus consideraciones sobre la economía dominicana, que yo sé que es del interés de todos ustedes. De todos modos, vamos a tratar de ponerle a nuestros visitantes cuál es el procedimiento habitual. A nuestro invitado, señor Kremer, le damos la oportunidad de poner sus consideraciones y luego los periodistas hacen preguntas y en una segunda parte los invitamos a almorzar y luego que recargan hacemos otra ronda de preguntas. Por alguna razón de tiempo ellos necesitan aprovechar que avancemos lo más que se pueda, así que vamos a tratar de hacer 2 periodos lo más acortado posible, de manera que a las 2 de la tarde, 2:15, hayamos concluido. Bienvenido. Señor Kremer, lo invito a que nos exponga sus consideraciones que le parezcan oportunas sobre la economía dominicana, qué lo trae al país la economía internacional, cómo puede incidir en la economía dominicana y, desde luego, cuáles son los fundamentos del Premio Nobel 2019. Bienvenido.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll speak in English. So apologies for that. Why don't I start with what you suggested of saying a little bit about the approach for which Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, and I received the Nobel Prize, and then I could maybe say a little bit, and Minister Contreras could say a bit about the work that we hope to do in the Dominican Republic on this. And you know, I know that if it helps with the timing, we could just continue the discussion during lunch. That's fine with me as well. So the basic work for which we were awarded the prize, at some level, is extremely simple and maybe in retrospect extremely obvious. I sometimes wonder why we got a prize for this. So there's an approach that's actually been known and is used for quite widely in other fields other than economics, and has really advanced knowledge tremendously. And it's used, one example perhaps where it's been used the most is in medicine, but it's also used by many private technology companies today. So in medicine, it's known as randomized controlled trials. And if a new medicine, if somebody's going to propose a new medicine or a new vaccine, the first step is to make sure that it actually works, and also, of course, that it's safe. And so, traditionally, there were all sorts of things that people who were trying to improve health tried, leeches and all sorts of other things. And lifespans were, for many centuries, until very recent, until the 19th century, in fact, the early 20th century, lifespans worldwide were very short, and mortality was very high. And then we saw a revolution in health. And there are many individual discoveries that contributed to that, but there was also a change in this. There was a technique of doing randomized trials, because the approach was have some group get treated, have some comparison group, make sure these groups are truly comparable prior to treatment, typically using randomization, and then follow up afterwards and see what the difference is in terms of how their health outcomes are. And this led to this, in part, it was one of the factors that led to this huge improvement, both in our scientific understanding and to our practical human health and development of drugs. If you think about, this is a very different field, but technology companies are doing similar tests. If you think about Amazon or Microsoft or Google, they're all the time trying to make their products better. And they're trying small changes to their websites to improve their products. They try to see what gets more customer response, what retains customers more. And then they try this on a small sample of the people viewing their website. They learn what works, and then they for the things that are successful, they try it more broadly. So really, all that Abhijit, Esther, and I did was to try to apply similar techniques to government programs, particularly we've each worked in a number of different countries. I'll give, just to make this concrete, I'll give one example from Colombia. Colombia in the 1990s had a program that provided vouchers for people who wanted to. They had a lot of children in primary school, but they were trying to expand access to secondary school. They provided a lot of vouchers. But they didn't have enough for everybody, so they had a lottery, not for research reasons, but for fairness reasons. There were more applicants than there were money that they had for the vouchers, so they had a lottery. We compared the winners and losers, so it's very much like a randomized trial in medicine. And in that particular case, we saw the winners seem to do better, and they actually wound up probably earning more later in life. And so that's an example of using this technique to evaluate a government program. Turning to the Dominican Republic, the Colombian example was one where this was sort of an accident. They didn't do this for research reasons. They did this to learn about the policy. In particular, they did it for fairness reasons. So some governments are when you talk to the government about trying to do this to evaluate their policies, to learn what's working and what's not, sometimes governments you have different reactions in different cases. I think the ideal reaction would be, yes, we want to learn about what things are working, what things aren't, so we can modify, so we can learn, so we can get better over time. But also, of course, it's possible for people to be defensive and to worry about, is this going to, what if it yields negative results, etc. I would, we had connected, the government of the Dominican Republic had reached out to our team quite a while ago. This was, I think the initial contacts were from the economic advisor to the president, Pedro Silverio. And that initiated a series of discussions, and we followed up with Minister Contreras, and we've had a number of conversations in the and with the
la viceministra Shaker en educación y estamos en general sumamente emocionados de ver el compromiso real que tiene el gobierno de la República Dominicana en mejorar sus políticas y en las evaluaciones para tratar de aprender realmente qué está funcionando, qué no está funcionando y cómo mejorarlo. Así que anoche tuvimos la oportunidad de conocer al presidente y pudimos compartir información importante entre nosotros.
Is coming from the very top. So happy to discuss some of the ideas of particular projects. These are all, these are projects coming from the government of the Dominican Republic they're not ideas coming from us. We're just trying to help with the evaluation of them. I will say one thing you'd asked about other lessons about any thoughts on the overall economy of the Dominican Republic or the global economy. I'm unfortunately, I realize this may not be as exciting from a media point of view, but one thing that we've learned over and over again in doing these evaluations is we know much less than we think we know. We're constantly being surprised. So I'm going to be a little bit reluctant I don't know much about the overall economy of the Dominican Republic, so I'm going to be probably, I'm a little bit reluctant to say things about that, but I am happy to talk about, the evaluation agenda.
Si me permite, para complementar las palabras del profesor Kremer, el Estado Dominicano y quienes somos responsables de promover políticas públicas, estamos obligados a hacerlo bien. El Estado Dominicano está obligado con la ciudadanía dominicana a invertir bien sus recursos y a lograr resultados sociales que todos deseamos al menor costo posible, con el mayor impacto posible, potenciando las sinergias, logrando buenas articulaciones, logrando que las contradicciones entre políticas sean la menor posible. Esa es una responsabilidad, promover esto es una responsabilidad fundamental del Ministerio de Economía, Planificación y Desarrollo. Y esto lo hacemos a través de la planificación. A veces se piensa que la planificación es un libro, que es un plan, pero que al final los gobiernos y las autoridades hacen lo que quieran. Bueno, la idea es ir transformando eso, construyendo un sistema nacional de planificación mucho más robusto, en donde todas las instituciones tomen en serio los planes, los objetivos y los esfuerzos conjuntos que tenemos que hacer para lograr las metas más importantes en cada una de las áreas, en materia de salud, en materia de educación, en materia de infraestructura vial, de medio ambiente, de empleo, de calidad, en fin. En ese contexto existe lo que se llama la Comisión Nacional de Seguimiento y Evaluación. Es una comisión creada por decreto hace ya varios años, la cual coordina el Ministerio de Economía. Estamos, digamos, bajo la supervisión del Ministerio de Economía, el Ministerio de la Presidencia, el Ministerio de Economía por razones obvias, ¿no? Es el ministerio responsable de la planificación, pero al mismo tiempo del Ministerio de la Presidencia por precisamente ser la cabeza, digamos, del gobierno, está muy cerca del presidente. El Ministerio de Hacienda porque le importa cómo se inviertan los recursos. Y el Ministerio de Administración Pública porque tiene un rol fundamental en todo el tema del funcionamiento del sector público. Entonces, esta comisión nacional, digamos, es responsable de articular un sistema nacional de seguimiento y evaluación. Y esto es una pieza fundamental para hacer buenas políticas públicas. Tenemos que darle seguimiento a lo que hacemos, ver si estamos obteniendo los resultados o no estamos obteniendo los resultados, si estamos produciendo lo que debemos producir para obtener los resultados o no, o en qué medida, si estamos recibiendo los recursos necesarios para lograr eso, si los procesos están adecuadamente articulados, bien conformados. Y esto es un proceso continuo de hacer y revisar, hacer y revisar. Y hemos desarrollado un importante conjunto de capacidades en el Ministerio de Economía y en el Estado en sentido amplio para avanzar en esa dirección. Una de esas tareas, además de tener todos estos, ir construyendo indicadores continuos, tenemos, ¿cuántos indicadores, Luis Mabeli? Tenemos más de 400 indicadores de seguimiento de políticas públicas en la República Dominicana. O sea que por ahí hemos avanzado bastante, en unas áreas mucho más que en otras. En áreas de bienestar humano es donde hemos avanzado más. Hay temas en todo el mundo, por ejemplo, tenemos desafíos de construir indicadores en materia ambiental, ¿ya? Donde estamos un poco más rezagados, repito, en todo el mundo. Y es normal porque la agenda ambiental ahora es la que está teniendo mucho más fuerza en los últimos 10 años, ¿no? Entonces, el seguimiento, digamos, hemos estado haciendo un buen trabajo, pero en materia de evaluación, significa hacer un análisis riguroso, basado en datos, en evidencia. Digamos, hay mucho más por hacer. Evaluar significa analizar con mucho detalle, con mucha rigurosidad, mucha sistematicidad, programas que se consideren absolutamente esenciales, importantes, o programas con los cuales hay suficiente dato, evidencia, información, una base para ser evaluado, que permita realizar el trabajo y que permita ver si se está haciendo bien, si se está haciendo regular, si se está haciendo mal, qué se puede corregir, si hay que descartarlo del todo y hay que repensar el programa. En fin, la evaluación es una herramienta y una actividad fundamental para hacer buena política pública. Hay algo importante que el profesor Kremer, en las pocas horas que tiene en el país, ha estado insistiendo, y es que no se trata de aprobar o quemar a las instituciones y a los programas. Se trata de aprender, y eso es muy importante. Yo creo que todas las instituciones públicas, pero también el sector privado, debería estar abierto y entusiasmado de que puedan ser, de que sus programas, sus intervenciones, sus acciones puedan ser evaluadas, porque es la única manera de ir transformando, aprendiendo. Las instituciones exitosas de cualquier naturaleza, el profesor Kremer lo ha dicho en la estadía acá, son aquellas que evalúan continuamente para precisamente innovar. La innovación es, digamos, clave del éxito en lo que sea. Estar, digamos, 2 pasos, 3 pasos adelante, mirando al futuro. ¿Qué podemos proveer nuevo, distinto, que sea relevantes, satisfactorios para el objetivo que nos queremos alcanzar. Entonces, en el Ministerio tenemos la misión, el empeño de robustecer en la República Dominicana instituciones para la evaluación y ir creando una cultura de evaluación. Y es por eso que estamos organizando, iniciando esta noche con la conferencia del profesor Kremer, en el aula magna de la UAS, el Foro Internacional de Evaluación y Desarrollo. Evaluación y Desarrollo, evaluación para el desarrollo. Evaluación para el desarrollo. Porque entonces, es un foro que convoca a toda la sociedad, pero especialmente, claramente, a los especialistas del gobierno, de la sociedad civil, de la academia, para discutir en qué punto estamos en esa materia de evaluación, cuál ha sido nuestra experiencia. La impresión que tenemos es que mucho de la evaluación que se ha hecho en la República Dominicana, o una parte importante de la evaluación, ha sido, digamos, no ha sido sistemática, no ha sido suficientemente sistemática, aislada, ejemplos, casos específicos, frecuentemente solicitado por organismos internacionales que financian, que proveen apoyo financiero para el despliegue de estos programas y de estas intervenciones. Y queremos superar esa etapa y crear capacidades y avances frecuentemente hechas por consultores o organismos no estatales o no nacionales. La idea es crear capacidades nacionales en el Estado, pero también fuera del Estado, y crear una comunidad de evaluación. Bien, muchas gracias.
Marte.
Intervenir primero. Mira, yo quisiera que nos enfocáramos en el tema que nos convoca aquí, Germán, y me disculpas, no quiero tampoco especular sobre lo que pueda pasar en Medio Oriente, como tú bien señalas, unas dinámicas terriblemente dolorosas, deshumanizantes, pero es difícil ponerse a especular en este momento. Yo quisiera que habláramos un poquito más de evaluación y de políticas públicas en la República Dominicana y los esfuerzos que estamos haciendo por evaluar programas críticos. Estamos trabajando con el Development Innovation Lab, que encabeza el profesor Kremer, pensando en temas como, por ejemplo, el programa de inglés por inmersión. Queremos evaluar ese programa, estamos en esa intención. También queremos evaluar el programa 1424, que lo que procura es insertar en el sistema educativo o en el sistema o en el trabajo a una población joven que ni estudia ni trabaja. Queremos evaluar algunos programas probablemente estamos sentando las bases para quizás evaluar programas en el Ministerio varios programas en el Ministerio de Educación. Así que yo creo que me gustaría conducir la conversación, orientarla en esa dirección.
Yeah, as I said, I'm reluctant to speak about. I think I'd like to focus my remarks on areas where I really have more knowledge, and I'm not a macroeconomist or a specialist, and certainly I'm very far from a specialist in diplomacy, so I probably can't really remark on that. on that issue, but happy to discuss other issues where I've got more expertise.
Millicent.
I think we've learned over the years. We've learned a lot of lessons about approaches to poverty reduction at a very specific, concrete level, for a variety of reasons, including through the experimental approach. So one lesson is that. Let me start with something not particularly from the experimental approach, but just something that that we've seen at a global level, but Dominican Republic is really a key example of this. At a global level, there had been up until maybe the end of the last century, certainly up through close to the end of the last century, there hadn't been any systematic tendency for convergence in incomes across countries. But since during this century, during the 21st century, we've seen strong evidence of convergence in incomes. In other words, we've seen faster growth rates of countries that are not at the very top income level, and there's been catch-up. And a key, and we don't know all the reasons for that, but Dominican Republic has had very high growth rates relative to many other countries. And I'm not an expert on the Dominican Republic, it might be very effective. At the same time, you need to test to see whether it actually works in practice. So the governments, we're in discussions with the government about the possibility of doing an evaluation on that. Another area would be the government's brought in a education program on sexual education and values, and that may be very important. And I think there's evidence from a number of smaller scale studies done elsewhere. I was involved in a study that showed some potentially beneficial effects from this, but the government wants to carefully evaluate its program and to learn, for example, does this reduce teenage pregnancy? Well, if it's possible to reduce teenage pregnancy, it's very important to know that, and if adjustments to the program are needed, that's also important to know. So we hope that we'll be able to support the government as it plans an evaluation of that program. A third program in education relates to students who are overage students. So there are some students who are older than so there's who for whatever reason are somewhat behind in terms of their learning compared to their age. And the government's concerned about, and that's not just something true in the Dominican Republic, it's true worldwide, and it's particularly true since COVID, and it can be particularly true with it can be particularly true in disadvantaged populations. And so trying to figure out how this problem can be corrected is very important. And if we look at research from around the world, it actually gives great grounds for optimism. There have been a number of cases, more than a number of cases, in which either what's called structured pedagogy, I'm happy to explain more about what that entails, or programs that are designed specifically to help meet the children where they are and orient the education not where they theoretically should be, but where they actually are now, can help them catch up. In some cases, catch up remarkably rapidly so that they can get back on track. So but again, we need to test that program, and that's partly what we'll be doing.
Señor Kremer, a propósito de la educación, ¿qué es conveniente para países como República Dominicana? Una educación superior universitaria o una educación técnica?
Great. Thanks very much for that question. So I think one thing that the government has, a big initiative of the government, and one that they've told us that they're very interested in learning about, and had the opportunity to meet the Minister for Higher Education, is something that really enables both at a certain level, which is the English immersion program. So this program can be useful. The Minister for Higher Education was explaining to me, this program could be useful both for people who want to go get more advanced skills, maybe get PhDs in Germany, because PhD programs in Germany might be taught in English, but it's also useful for people who want to work, say, in the tourism sector. And so, this is, the government's put significant resources into this, but it wants to evaluate it, to learn what the impact is. And we'd certainly be very happy to work with the government to think, and these are early discussions. We just met the minister yesterday, but we'd love to try to work with the government to see, is there a way to understand the impact of this program, to learn, does it help people actually earn more, or does it not have that impact in vocational sense, and what does it do in terms of higher education as well? Just on the broader issue, I think there's the issue of vocational education is one where I think there are a lot of studies in some contexts showing limited impact, but then there's also some very important studies showing positive impact. And for example, in Colombia, there are a number of studies, one of which I was involved in, which found particularly strong positive impact. And when I mentioned before the positive results from on earnings from the secondary school voucher program. Now, we broke down those results, and when people applied for the program, they could apply either to a purely academic secondary school or to a secondary school that, of course, taught the academic subjects, but also taught some vocational subjects. And what we saw was, actually, most of the earnings gains were driven by the students who applied to those schools. And there are other studies in Colombia suggesting high return to vocational education. So probably most of the studies don't find that, but there are some studies which do, and I think it's worth trying to learn about what are the successful programs. How do you design successful programs? So ideally, every economy, every society needs both standard academic higher education and vocational education. I think really the question is, how can we make each of those better? Obviously, the finance ministry has to decide how much money to put in each, but really I think we can probably make both of those better. And for different people, they'll be making different choices about what they want to study.
Thank you. Adelante.
El problema de resultados, de obtener resultados en la gestión, no solamente depende de recursos, sino de buena gestión de esos recursos. Y creo que en esto ayudaría la planificación y la evaluación. Pero para nosotros tener una idea de cuán importante pudiera ser aplicar la propuesta que ustedes hacen para la República Dominicana, nos gustaría que ustedes nos den algunos resultados de programas en los que ustedes han intervenido, qué había cuando iniciaron y qué resultados se tuvo al final, para tener una idea de qué podríamos lograr con ese tipo de programas, por favor.
Sure, happy to answer that. And by the way, I don't want to delay lunch for people. I'm happy to keep talking over lunch if they want to serve lunch. So let me give an example of something that was early in my career. So there's been time to examine the impact of this. So this is an issue that sounds very minor, maybe sounds a little bit boring. Maybe, in fact, I should explain this issue before we delve too heavily into lunch. This is the issue of worms, intestinal worms, hookworm, whipworm, roundworm. These are very common around the world. They're common including, they're particularly common in school children. They exist in the Dominican Republic, they exist in the United States, Japan, Italy, Kenya, India. So these worms they're very easy to treat. It's very inexpensive. The medicine costs a few pennies. It's medicine safe, but diagnosis is somewhat expensive. And I won't go into the details, but you need stool samples, etc. It's not easy. Okay. So what the World Health Organization recommends in areas with high worm prevalence is just in schools, if the prevalence is above 20%, everybody should be treated. If it's above 50%, treat twice a year, just presumptively. So we worked with a small nonprofit organization in Kenya, and they were rolling out their program, but they were very small. They started in one set of schools. Later they expanded to another. Finally they expanded to a third set of schools. That meant that partway through we could examine the schools where they'd already started. They ordered the schools so they would be comparable. And so partway through we could examine the schools that had already been treated and compare the students to ones that hadn't been treated. And what we found, our short-run result, was that we saw that that students were more likely to be in school. They were missing less school. And in fact, later we saw that, that girls in particular, this was primary school, they were more likely to go on to secondary school. This was a lower income country than Dominican Republic, so not everyone was going to secondary school. But then we followed up over time. And what we found was people were earning considerably more when they became adults, because it's now 20 years later. So they're earning between, say, 7% and 14% more. Now remember, this program costs pennies per dose, the medicine. If you include all the costs of administering the drugs, training the teachers to administer the drugs, maybe 50 cents per child per year. So the government's putting in 50 cents per child per year, or whoever, the NGO to start with, and they're getting back permanently higher incomes for all of these students over their life, over much, at least we know now, over much of their lifetime, or much of their working lifetime. So this is a phenomenal investment if we just looked at this purely financially, and of course also all these social benefits. Well, we were able to share those results with the Ministry of Education in Kenya, with the Ministry of Health, with the World Bank. The government of Kenya decided it wanted to move this from an NGO program to a national program. So they went to all the areas of Kenya where this was a problem, where worms were a problem, and they instituted this program. And I was actually recently in Kenya again, and we saw the results that the Kenyan Medical Research Institute had done. They'd done a new survey, and worm prevalence had fallen dramatically in these areas. So not only were they treating the children who had worms, but they were actually really addressing the overall epidemiological situation. Partway through, the government of India heard about these results. State governments in India started doing this, and eventually the national government in India did it as well. And every year now in India, almost 200 million children are being treated in India for worms. And again, we're seeing some preliminary results in India suggesting similar, very sharp drops in worm levels in the parts of India where they've introduced this program. So that's an example of how things that are not, things that are at some level very technical and understanding, but it might not be the first thought of what would you do to improve education. It might not be, oh, we should try to improve school health and address worms, but something that that is actually very inexpensive, can make a huge difference. And with that evidence, it's not, there are many things in life that are politically controversial, but this is not politically controversial. And that's why the governments were able to scale this up. And I think that's one example, but there are other examples of the long-run difference that this can make. By the way, I don't know the situation in Dominican Republic, but my understanding is there's some parts of the Dominican Republic where worms are a problem here still. I don't know what the government policy is on that.
Angel. Óptica, ¿qué elementos deben cambiarse de manera estructural o mejorarse en la República Dominicana con vistas a mantener ese crecimiento económico y que sea más inclusivo y menos extractivo?
So, I don't know enough about the Dominican Republic, but I'll say some results that I've had in other contexts, and perhaps they're relevant to Dominican Republic, perhaps they're not. I'm happy to discuss it more if people have thoughts of whether these are relevant elsewhere in Dominican Republic. But in general, in high-income countries, it's typically possible for people to take out a certain types of loan using the asset that they borrow as collateral. So obviously, if people want to buy a house, they get a mortgage on the house, and that house, and then if they fail to pay the loan, then the people who gave them the mortgage could take back the house, and that's why they're willing to give them the loan to buy the house. Same for a car loan, etc. So these are partly used by individuals, but they're also used by businesses for productive investment. This type of asset collateralized loan is very common. And if the asset is one that is, not every asset is suitable for this, but obviously a house is suitable, a car may be suitable. And this can be used to collateralize a reasonable portion of the loan. It's usually some down payment, but you can at least collateralize part of the loan with the asset. Now, borrowing terms in lower income countries are sometimes very restrictive. And if you can't, if the only way you can borrow is by pledging assets that you already own, you create a trap where people who are poor can't go invest in a business because they can't get the equipment to invest in the business because they can't borrow to do this. Now, obviously, you can have problems, and the U.S. has had problems because we made it too easy to borrow at certain times. But I think there's a widespread view that it can be too difficult to borrow in some other countries. So we were looking at a program for farmers. These were for dairy farmers who are, and I know that there's a dairy industry in Dominican Republic, but I don't know how it works. But in this other country, the dairy farmers these were small farmers. They each had just a few cows, sometimes one or two cows, and but they were organized in a cooperative, and the cooperative had a savings and loan association. And the cooperative initially said that if you want, they would only they could lend to people, but only if they already had enough money in the bank to put cash down to collateralize the loan. So it was very hard for people to borrow, and only 2.4% of people borrowed. Okay? So let me say what the asset was. This was an area where these farmers depended on dairy cattle. Again, I'm going to get somewhat technical, maybe it's boring, but dairy farmers need lots of water for their cattle. The cows need water every day. And And this was an area where people didn't necessarily have regular water supplies. It was a lower income country than the Dominican Republic. So people wanted to put equipment, big tanks on their houses to collect the water from the roof when it rained and to store the water. These cost a fair amount relative to the income of the farmers. So and so that's why only 2.4% of farmers could afford them. Once they changed the rules, they allowed farmers to borrow using the water tanks as collateral. Then that went up to 40%, more than 40% of farmers borrowed. And they got these tanks, and when we looked, there were hardly any defaults. There was just a very small number of cases where farmers failed to repay the loans. So this turned out to be a good financial product from the point of view of the Savings and Loan Association. It was obviously very good for the farmers. We actually saw some benefits. One of the tasks that women and girls were often involved in is collecting water. They didn't have to do this as much anymore. So we saw at least some evidence that girls were more likely to stay in school. So this is an example where a small change in the borrowing rules led to big improvements. Now, look, this was a different country. The same thing may not apply in the Dominican Republic, but what I think does apply is that it's worth thinking about, could you think about increasing access to credit? And could you do some sort of test of an approach? Maybe you're scared that it would have negative effects, people won't repay that. Fine, maybe do a small test of it. See whether it's working. And then if you find that it's not working, then fine. But if you find that it's working, then that's something that could be scaled up. And sometimes this is a purely private sector decision. Sometimes government regulators might have to be involved as well because the financial sector is heavily regulated.
La palabra a Monseñor Marrero, pero a continuación lo invito a almorzar. Marrero.
Me interesaría saber el grado de importancia que República Dominicana debe conferir en sus planes desarrollistas a las alianzas público-privadas. Debe ser fundamental, debe ser parte del perfil de esfuerzo desarrollista o ser simplemente un aspecto secundario o medio.
Yeah. I think one thing that we've learned over the years is that a successful economy requires both a private sector and a public sector. This is, maybe it seems obvious, but there were times when people thought the public sector could run everything, and they clearly can't. That doesn't lead to very good economic outcomes. But we also need things like basic social safety nets. We need, I mentioned before, the provision of preventive health care for communicable disease. That's something that is an investment that benefits us all and requires the public sector. Things like, this is one thing I'm working on right now is the impact of strategies for addressing climate change. Having basic weather forecasts, that's something that needs to be done at the level of governments or even actually at the level of regions, because the weather forecasts can affect many countries in the region. So you need both the private and public. Now the question is not do we need private and do we need public, but what mix and how do they work together? And there, I think that's something where, again, the details are really going to matter. We know that there can be there can be very negative examples of the public and private sector working together, where basically this turns into the public sector just transferring resources to the private sector, for example, and not actually getting what the public sector wants. There can also be very successful examples of this. And so the question is, how can we design public-private interaction to get better outcomes? And here I'd like to actually ask my colleague at the University of Chicago, Michael Dinnerstein, to talk about some, if he could briefly describe some research that he's done in the Dominican Republic, I guess in two areas. One is on procurement, where the public and private sector naturally work together, and the other is in education itself.
Sure, I'm happy to talk briefly about some work that I've done thinking about how the public and private sector can not just coexist, but complement each other. I've studied this first in the education system, where you think that often providing education is a very core service for the public sector, the government does it. But also we have many examples where there are lots of private schools, say for primary education or secondary education, that are quite successful and often find models that can deliver larger learning gains. And so there are various types of interactions between these sectors that can make them both better. If you have them both, that puts a little bit of pressure on each of them to perform well, but they can also learn from each other. And so sometimes you have examples where a private sector might try out new practices or new ways of teaching. And if that's successful, then it can be, the public sector can learn from that. And it can go the other way as well. And so there's both competitive impacts as well as learning from each other, such that these two sectors, at least in the education system as I found, can coexist quite successfully. There's also, thinking about how do you grow new industries. And so I've looked at the construction industry here in the Dominican Republic, especially around actually building the public schools. And a lot of the construction was done by fairly new firms. Well, often we have maybe firms that could be quite productive if they have a big initial investment and a lot of business, but it's hard to get that if you don't yet have a reputation or the experience. And so sometimes one can design procurement systems such that they can get new industries or new firms going, that they eventually get the experience so they grow to be quite successful later. So these are just examples that I've seen in the Dominican Republic where the two sectors can work together to the benefit of both.
En lo prometido, los invito a almorzar y a la vuelta, al regreso, una pregunta para el ministro Isa Contreras.